And we have an incredible group of panelists today. I cannot wait to hear from them. Before we start, I just want to get a sense of the room here today. I want to just quickly ask, who in this room on this bright and early Monday morning in Times Square, obviously you are here because you care about these issues. I also just want to get a sense of who in this room is here in some sense because you have been able to control your fertility. You have been able to control your sexual and reproductive health and rights in some way. I just want to get a show of hands. Okay, that looks to be just about everyone, and I would like to submit for the record, it was not only the women in the room, not only the men in the room, we have folks of all different ages and races and all of that, so this is not an over there issue that we're talking about today. This is a deeply personal issue, and there's not any one thing that brought you into this room today, but we do know that this is an important piece of the puzzle that we're talking about. So we have an incredible group of panelists. My name is Lori Adelman, and I am Vice President of Influence and Engagement at Global Fund for Women. Global Fund for Women is a multi-regional women's fund, so we support grassroots movements and organizations working on the front lines of gender justice causes. And we do so in flexible ways. Flexible feminist philanthropy is what we are working on. And today I am actually going to let our panelists introduce themselves because there's no way that I could do them justice. They are very esteemed panelists. We're amazing to have them. And what is really interesting, I think, is having them in conversation with each other. Because these are leaders from a number of different sectors that work together and that need to keep working together, and that's what we're going to be touching on a little bit today. Some housekeeping. You can tweet about what you're seeing today. I believe the hashtag is Equal Futures. You can also use UNGA77 because some folks can't be in the room today. We're very privileged to be here, and so we want to make sure we can bring everybody into the conversation. I know most, if not all of us, are actually online as well, so you can tweet us, tag us, and tag the organizers as well, because it's because of them that we're here. So I want to thank the organizers, everyone who you heard speak, everyone who's made today possible. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. So let's jump in. I just want to test the waters a little bit. I want to make sure we're awake, we're alive, the brain cells are brain celling. So I'm going to just throw out a little bit of a just test question. And I want you to try to do this in 30 seconds or less. Not all the answers will be that. I know this is a topic that inspires passion. I know we could talk about it forever, but let's just start and see if we can keep a short answer. I just want to get a sense from you, temp check, how critical is the issue that we're talking about today, contraceptive access, how critical is that to the broader issue of gender equality and gender justice? So just get a temp check from you on that. And actually, I think I'm gonna start in the middle here. My eyes drawn to pink. So just introduce yourself, say a word, your name, what you do, and then how critical.
All right. I'm Geralyn Ritter. I'm responsible for external affairs, public policy, ESG, sustainability at Organon. We are a new women's healthcare company, but I like to call us a startup at scale because we spun off from Merck last year as a fully independent company. So we are not new to women's health by any means. Many of us had the privilege of being very involved in the launch and planning around Merck from others, but we are so thrilled now to be at a brand new company where our primary focus is the health of women, day in, day out, it drives our business development, it drives our core corporate strategy. That is why we are here. So that is me, and do I think contraception, how important? I mean, I struggle to think of an intervention that is more important, because when women can choose when and whether to get pregnant, they can stay in school. Contraception equals education. When they can time their pregnancies for when they are ready, they can contribute to their community. They can become economically independent before having children, or create a job that they can do while they are raising their family. So education, economic independence, and above all, health. Health. When a woman's body, a girl's body, is not ready to have a child because she is too young, or she has too recently just had a child, or sometimes for reasons we still don't understand, pregnancy can be terribly risky in parts of this world, including parts of the country we're sitting in right now. So the access to affordable, available contraception, to me, it's the key switch. If we don't flip that, we don't get gender equity.
Thank you, Laurie, and good morning, everyone. Yes, like Rupa said, shout out. This is indeed the first of, I think, a really, really exciting set of days. My name is Julitta Onabanjo, and I'm the Global Director for UNFPA's Technical Division here in UNFPA's headquarters in New York. Really glad to be sharing this stage. I am a public health physician by profession. I'm a sexual and reproductive health, I think, warrior by I would say vocation. And I like to think I'm a champion of young people, and I guess I've been growing my shoulders so that particularly women of color could stand on this and go up higher. So that's me, and that's who I am. You know, as I looked, and Laurie, I think you posed a really great question to colleagues here, and it was nice to see all the hands up, and I think it made me also feel a little bit sad, because if you had switched that in terms of the environment we were, and you put that to a group of people sitting in someplace in Africa, you won't get that same response. So it is critical that I think what we have and the privileges that we have from where we sit advances this agenda. Because indeed, as Geraldine said, to me, contraceptive access is, and you said, the key. Indeed, it is the key. I think gender equality is the key to what Rupa said about a world that's secure, what Rachel talked about in terms of peace and prosperity. And to get to gender equality, contraceptives are just the important key. So the logic, to me, is very clear. But the realities, the stories are very different. And so if you asked what happened to that 15-year-old girl in South Sudan, where she was kicked out of school because she's pregnant and didn't even have a clue how she even got there, that is why this is important. If you asked a 32-year-old lady in Accra who wanted to space her families so that she can get a job, that she can earn a living to develop her community and her family, to her, that's why this is important. And so that's the connection that I would make.
Thank you, Julitta. My name is Karl Hofmann. I'm the president and CEO of Population Services International, which is a nonprofit global health social marketing company based in Washington, but working in 45 countries around the world, and with a long history in, among other things, contraception. So thank you for the question, Lori. I don't think there's a lot of controversy in this room about this, right? I would say, it's the ability of contraception to separate sex and pleasure from procreation that makes it so powerful in its contribution, in fact, essential in its contribution to gender equity. But that very character of contraception, it's actually more than that, it's revolutionary, which is why it engenders such resistance from the forces of traditionalism and patriarchy and misogyny. And Rachel gave us a fantastic and very uplifting set of comments this morning, and I associate with them as a former employee of the State Department myself. I'm proud of the work that happens there and across the US government. But we know it isn't always like that, depending on who's in charge, right? So I think, the last time, I'm going over 30 seconds, I apologize. The last time we would have gotten together in New York for UNGA Week, this agenda of women's empowerment and the advance of the status of women and girls and those who identify as women, it felt inevitable. It felt like this was an escalator that was just moving up. It was only a question of how fast. But recent years have reminded us that is not the case. And we have a big fight ahead of us. So, let me have that.
So you see what I mean when I say that we have some really amazing panelists today. And of course we are missing one voice. So we do have a panelist who has been delayed on her way. We hope that she will be able to make it because Ashlee is an incredible advocate and a women delivery young leader. So when she does arrive, we will bring her right up here. And I'm not going to pass the mic to any other youth that I see in the room. That we do want more youth voices. So I'll resist the urge of doing that. But what I do want to do is just follow up on some of the things that have been raised and get into a little bit more of a discussion because you heard sort of the stakes laid out in what all of our panelists mentioned. This is important, this is critical, this is essential, it's a revolution. We heard how important it is, and we saw that there is broad support in this room. So why does this unmet need persist? And Karl, you mentioned resistance. So we can't just stop at this is important, this is great, this is everything, because we do see persistent unmet needs. So I want to talk to you, Julitta, about the UNFPA role, because UNFPA is really at the forefront of this as the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, and under really incredible leadership, you are blazing, I think, a trail for courage and bravery and passion about these issues in a new way. And you're a core partner of the FP 2030 partnership. So given your agency's position, I think we all want to hear about what are you prioritizing today, knowing the difficult landscape that we are facing. What are the core programs and themes that you all are investing in today?
Thank you, Laurie. And I think the first investment really is exactly what Karl said. It's the resistance. I feel if there's any multilateral organization that is dealing with one of those topics that indeed globally has resistance from many fronts, including in countries where we think development and progress is moving forward. The ability to discuss, to program, to ensure, to guarantee reproductive rights, reproductive health, reproductive justice, sexual and reproductive health in general is really very tough. And so continuously, one of the things that we do as the UN Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency is actually figure out how to work in this environment, figure out how we ensure that governments understand why it's important to program. And so a lot of it is around positioning, is around the politics of it, and navigating that. And it's around them ensuring that those programs are really fundamentally, and they reach the grassroots. And it requires partnerships, it requires intelligence, it requires a whole range of things. And so in a reality, UNFPA works in 150 countries, and there isn't one of those countries where we haven't had to look at issues around the whole landscape for sexual and reproductive health and rights. In addition to that, one of the things that we look at, and the landscape can be political at the policy level, but it's also very much, and this is what you talked about, vis-a-vis patriarchy, misogyny. What is happening in families and communities? And for many of the countries, and we, like I said, we work in 150 of those, it's the community level, the understanding of some of those social and cultural norms, many of them gender-loaded, many of them discriminatory, that actually is where one needs to work. And so we work with feminist groups, women's groups, but also with cultural and social sort of structures to really ensure that they understand, again, why it's really important to work on these issues. And I'll give you an example in West Africa where indeed a very pronatalistic region. In Niger, women have 7 children in their lifetimes, and the exposure of that to maternal death and health is ridiculous. And yet a lot of that is driven by what families expect of women to do. What is the whole notion of the family, etc. And so we would work with traditional and religious communities to really ensure that they understand. We have established across West Africa what we call école des maris, husbands' schools, so that you are sensitizing men to understand why it's important that a woman should have access to a contraceptive. And so that's the community level. So we do the political upstream, we do the downstream, and maybe just 2 other things, and I'll pass on and we can talk a little bit more about what UNFPA does. But the other area we work on is financing. Because indeed, to really get this going, one needs the resources. And UNFPA is that UN agency that tracks the resource flows for sexual and reproductive health across the world. We do that as part of our commitment to the Commission on Population and Development. And with that, governments can look at how much they are actually spending. And in addition to that, we make a very strong case. And I know it's not, Rupa said, it's not how much, is the return on investment. This is people's lives. But indeed, for the Minister of Finance, who really fundamentally has to make priorities and decisions where budget goes, this is important for him. And so making the case for the $1 that you invest in family planning, the return on that in $8 in development or cost recoveries becomes key. And so that financing landscape, we pay particular attention to it in this UNFPA. We track budgets, we work with parliamentarians, we get national budget lines for contraceptives in there. And maybe the last thing is supplies. And UNFPA, I think second to the US government, is the largest supplier of and procurer of commodities. And we do that on behalf of governments. Last year alone, we procured $127 million US worth of commodities. What we're trying to do is expand the contraceptive choice, look at methods. One of the things that I think is going to be key, we had a report called Seeing the Unseen, which was on unintended pregnancies. And within that, I urge you to look at it. We looked at, male contraceptives, because I think as we talk about unmet need, we predominantly think about the woman. But indeed, as somebody said already, the unmet need for contraceptives amongst men is something that we need to be doing more. And as we look at research and technology, I think we need to question ourselves, why are there 40 methods for male in the works that have never seen the light of day? Why is it still the male condom and, withdrawal that accounts for 26% of contraceptives? Why is it that vasectomy, which is probably the most effective, thank you, my brother, means of contraceptive, less than 3% of couples are using it? So I think there's a whole range in that commodities and supplies that we look at. And we also look at not just the method and the method mix, but how it gets to the last one and how it's affordable for that person to get access to it. So a whole range of things the UNFPA does, very holistic, very much linked to our gender equality and our transformative results. And we have 3, and if there's anything you remember about us before you leave this, is that UNFPA's commitment to 2030 is threefold: to end preventable maternal deaths, to end unmet need for family planning, and to end gender-based violence, including harmful practices. And we feel to get to that, contraceptives are the key.
Thank you so much for that, and I think what you've done for everyone in this room is, I think, articulate all the different points where some advocacy, some pushing, some support, some partnership and solidarity is needed to end up with that vision that I think we all share, that for 2030 and beyond, of that cared for, of that supported, of that supported person who has their sexual and reproductive health and rights cared for. So thank you for the work that you do. It's incredible. And I think you mentioned some things that, Karl, I'm hoping you can pick up on, because you talked about the commodities piece, and you talked about the need for integration and really partnership. So Karl, for you, we have a very cross-sector panel here today, and that's by design. That's not by accident. And for me, when I think about PSI as an implementing partner, I think of you all as sort of sitting at a nexus of many of these sectoral intersections. You really help shape markets, help really drive access in communities. And so I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about the role of these different actors of the public, the private, of the NGO. How do you see that role maybe changing? We have been through a few things in the past few years. There is an ongoing pandemic, and so what are those roles? How have they shifted? And what role is everybody playing in advancing the integration of these issues of the commodities, of the supplies, and of the actual contraceptives?
Thanks, Laura. And thanks, Julitta, also for mentioning the examples that UNFPA brings to the struggle around the involvement of men. Les Écoles des Maris in West Africa are really effective and have been going on for a long time. And of course, it's a mistake for us to think, well, thank you for including me in the panel for that. It's a mistake for us to think about this as an issue for women and people who identify as women only. You did mention one male method, which is vasectomy, which is the one that I practice as a way to control my fertility. So permanent methods are out there too. The question of the different sectors that are involved in responding to this need in the marketplace. We know that from a lot of different research, we know that many people turn to the private sector. We often think of this as a public sector sort of conversation. Contraception in low resource settings, that's a public sector job. You mentioned governments and how they have to have a line item in the budget for it. But it's also very much a private sector job, and many of the health consumers in the Global South go to the private sector as a source for their health care, including contraception. In some places, as much as 40%, we think, of people are turning to the private sector depending on the region and depending on the income quintile. I think the private sector, in our experience, as we work with them around the world, it tends to be of often variable quality in terms of meeting the needs of consumers. So there's certainly work to be done in raising standards and the quality of care that one can find in the private sector, the indigenous private sector in many of the places where we work. I think enlightened governments look at their health systems as a multi-sectoral system, right? It's the public sector, it's the private sector, it's faith-based organizations, it's nonprofits like mine, NGOs that are active in providing some aspect of the health response. And ideally, they all work together in a coordinated fashion to meet different health needs, including sexual and reproductive health needs. It doesn't always happen. But I think that is the aim for any sort of enlightened government trying to mobilize all the different resources of the health system to respond to consumer needs. In the work that we do, significantly with indigenous private sectors trying to help improve their quality, I will say that I don't have the data, but anecdotally from my visits around the world to our different programs, many of these providers are women. Many of the, let's call them medical entrepreneurs, small private sector health providers in global south economies, many of them are women in the sexual and reproductive health space, certainly. So it's a great way also to think about this as an income generation sort of activity, how to mobilize them and drive them to greater performance to meet more consumer needs. I mentioned that we're a social marketing organization. Thank you, Lori, for acknowledging that we've tried to play a role in shaping markets to make them work better for our consumers. We archetype our consumer around the world. We think of her, we call her Sarah, as a way to archetype and sort of organize our marketing thinking. And private sector markets, public sector markets don't always work well for Sarah. The role of the social marketing sector is to try and ensure that those markets do work well for Sarah, that they are responding to those consumers' needs. And by the way, we think of them as consumers. They're health consumers. They may be very low resource families. They may have very few resources. Very often they're deciding whether to allocate resources to health or to education or to food, all priorities. But they're consumers and they deserve to be marketed to the same way that you and I were all marketed to 1,000 times today while walking to this building, right? Marketing and the discipline that I think social marketing brings to this idea of treating people as consumers helps to deliver better value to them, whether they're paying for the service or not. The pandemic has been obviously a challenge in so many ways, and we've seen how in many health indicators, just about every health indicator, I imagine, we've moved backwards over the last several years. The United States life expectancy has gone backwards 2 years in a row, shocking. This is true also in many other parts of the world. But, the pandemic also opened up the door to self-care. Rachel mentioned self-care in terms of taking care of ourselves, which is important. But self-care is also an emerging theory of how consumers can be more in charge of their own healthcare decisions. Just before the pandemic, the WHO published new self-care health guidelines. The pandemic imposed self-care as a way for people to deal with their health challenges or not, because they could not necessarily go to see a provider. And there are emerging technologies, not so new anymore, things like cyanopress, self-injecting, long-acting reversible contraception, or medical abortion technologies to allow for self-managed abortion. There are many other ways in which self-care was pushed to the fore during the pandemic and offers us, I think, a roadmap for the future. So the next time we talk about the multi-sectoral aspect of the health system, we would talk about private sector, public sector, faith-based NGOs, and the consumer. Sarah is a sector in the health system who is driving her own care. And I think that's one positive development from the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that. I'm struck by the dignity with which you're speaking about Sarah and by which all of those different factors can restore her dignity. So really appreciate all of those reflections. And I want to turn to you, Geralyn, because Organon, as you mentioned, is new, not necessarily completely new, but it's sort of this new formation. And we've been talking about the private sector, and I'm curious if you can share a little bit more about what specifically Organon is doing, and also, what role does the private sector play?
Absolutely. Well, I really appreciated Karl's comments on the multi-faceted role of the private sector. So, I think it's too simplistic to think of a big multinational as the private sector. Some of the most impactful private sectors are exactly the indigenous private sectors that are providing care on the ground in a tremendous number of countries and doing a good job of it in many instances under difficult situations. They've earned the trust of the community. And so, but from our perspective, there's a tremendous amount that we are already doing and that we can do. The most obvious is product. And so, but our policy, our advocacy, our engagement programs are always product agnostic. We want people to have access to the contraceptives of their choice. And we want them to have access to the most reliable methods of contraception, if that is what they want. So we can help with that. We can help by providing access to our products. We have a long-standing and recently renewed partnership with UNFPA. We've set public goals to ensure that we distribute in the least developed countries very low-cost, long-acting reversible contraceptives, at least 100 million units, aiming to prevent 120 million unintended pregnancies by 2030. And we're tracking that. We're committed to being accountable around those numbers and explaining where that data came from. But we all know that just having the products really isn't enough. We talk a lot in our company about meeting women where they are. If you're 18 years old and you're headed off to college for the first time, that's a different conversation than if you're a hardworking single mother in rural Alabama who just can't have a child right now or maybe already has two. That's a different conversation in terms of your needs. And I love the emphasis on men, maybe because I have 3 sons of an age where one might worry. And I just think it is critical, yes, in West Africa, but yes, in New Jersey and New York City, that our sons are part of the conversation and feel equally responsible. And we can do that in our education efforts. We need to avoid, yes, we want to reach women. Yes, we want to help them. No, it's not all their responsibility. Their partners have responsibilities too, and they should be held to it. So products, education, training and education kind of go together. Education probably more needs to be hyper-local, needs to be hyper-relevant to the consumer, but obviously you need a trained healthcare professional around certain types of contraceptives. And in too many of the contraceptive deserts that are out there around the world, those trained professionals don't exist. And that's yet another place where the private sector can play a role. Nobody knows our products better than us. We've got training programs that are absolutely scalable, and we make a big effort to get them out there. The last and most important element that I'll mention is innovation. We have tremendous options for contraception out there. This is not an area where we say, gee, we just don't have the right drug. We've got a lot of things that work really well. Do we have everything we need? No. I wish there were more options for men other than condoms and withdrawal and surgery. I wish there were more non-hormonal options for women that they might feel comfortable with. So we need to keep innovating, and we need more innovation around keeping women safe when they do become pregnant. And that's the kind of R&D that is frankly where the private sector shines. And it's one of the reasons that we were created to be 100% focused, and we have to be sustainable as a company. We're building our pipeline. So I guarantee you, we're talking with almost every women's health entrepreneur out there right now.
Thank you so much. You said so much there, but one thing that really resonated, and I want to emphasize it as well, because I know we don't have our full panel today, is just the different use cases that people have. And I think, there are some youth advocates who staged a bit of a coup and said, this term family planning we're not using that anymore because I'm not trying to plan a family. I have other uses. You know, going back to Karl's point, I just want to have sex. You know, and I think we need to get real as a community about that. And of course, the different use cases that exist. So appreciating that and the points about innovation, well taken. You know, I kind of want to open it up a bit to all of you now. You know, we just have a few minutes left, and I want all of the people in the room as well to think about your questions for the panelists, because we will save a few minutes for that. But I just kind of want to wrap by hearing a little bit more about this innovation piece, given the political landscape that we are in. I mean, it would be ridiculous not to name that there are these, you know, U.S. domestic and global forces of opposition. Everything that you all are saying makes sense to me. I think it makes sense to everyone in this room. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem that we are going sort of in that direction everywhere in the world. And you know, Julitta, UNFPA has declared unintended pregnancy as a global public health crisis. So I would love to kind of hear from all of you, you know, kind of a last remark in a way. What will it take to get us back on track? What needs to happen? Is it from a policy perspective? Is it from a partnership perspective? What needs to happen? And then anything that you kind of want to say about the next phase? Where do we need that innovation most? Is it in the products? Is it in the policy space, the advocacy space? What's needed? So where do we need to go? What's needed to happen? And then I want to hear from folks in the room. Okay, so anyone want to jump on that first? I see Karl looking reflective. Okay.
I'll do the easy bit, let them do that. But I think, you know, Laurie, this is just fantastic. And I really do want to say, to get us really back on track, I want to pick up again where Karl mentioned in terms of us all being on the same page and looking at the richness and partnerships across all sectors to be able to get this done. You know, UNFPA did a price tag as to what it would cost to get unmet need for family planning addressed with contraceptives. And that came to, the gap currently is 59.9 billion between now and 2030. So we all have to chip in this, but also we're all doing our bits. And so I do feel that it is important that the partnerships look and the beauty of PSI and some of the others in terms of this total market approach, where there are spaces for each partner to bring their bits and their strength in, is really key and fundamental. I do though want to focus in on Sarah. Because like Geraldine said, there's Sarah's all over the place. And for Sarah in Africa, her ability to have the education and have the means to actually get access is really a tough one. Whether it's the fact that she lives in poverty, whether it's the fact that she doesn't get to go to school because just gets her menses and keeps her out of school, or she doesn't have a school, whether she's on the move because of conflict and crisis, and this is the peace and insecurity that becomes really key and fundamental to watch, or the climate crisis, or the recession we see. And so for us, Sarah is the Amina who just does not have the privileges that we see. And in a way, that is where we really call for action. Because indeed, for her to even begin to think about self-care, for her, she needs to understand her body. She needs to understand many things, and education. We just came out of the Transform Education Summit. And I tell you, to even get health and sexual and reproductive health or comprehensive sexuality education into the outcome document was almost impossible. How do you transform an educational system when the one thing that can transform the life of the learner is not even in there? So we have a huge road ahead and a battle ahead, and voice and advocacy is going to be key and fundamental. So raise those voices Bob, shout out, be there for Amina and Sarah and all the young girls in the world. But the other thing I wanted to just add into the mix, and I think this is where the private sector is so good at, is actually data. Because in reality, to be able to pinpoint and segment and do the marketing share and who's, you need data. And you need inclusive, gender-sensitive data. It's disaggregated to find those who are those left behind. And in a way, I think we're doing some work. We have a population data portal that layers geospatial data. So where's the nearest clinic? Where's the poverty? Where are the households that are vulnerable, etc. And really gives you a visual representation of where you need to target interventions. But I think private sector does this great with big data, with some of the data systems. So as we think of innovation, I would urge us to think of innovation around data and how we analyze that, how we visualize that, and how we use that to do better in finding those most disadvantaged and vulnerable. And maybe the last innovation, and it comes from young people's creativity, I think we need to really focus in on how we get contraceptives to young people so that they can enjoy that pleasure of sex. But again, for the African, it's probably not because she's pushed into marriage and FGM and all sorts of things. But in reality, she will and she deserves that pleasure of sex too. So I would really just shout out for those guys too. But really, data and young people. I think we have
Yes, we have our, speaking of you, we have our Ashlee. Welcome, someone else join us, please. We're so glad that you could be here, and you're just in time because we have just been dancing around this question of hearing from your voice directly. So I'm going to maybe just interrupt our format a little bit so we can hear from Ashlee. Ashlee, do you just want to introduce yourself, just say a word or two about what you do? And I just do want to remind folks, get your questions ready because we'll still just take a few minutes to open it up after this.
Thank you so much. I am so glad to be here for the hectic morning. So I'm Ashlee Burnett, and I am from Trinidad and Tobago, and I am a 2020 Women Deliver Young Leader. And I'm actually in town for the Transforming Education Summit, so I was really happy to hear you speak about that. And I work with Transform Education, which is hosted by the UN Girls Education Initiative. My work back home in Trinidad and Tobago is centered around increasing access to comprehensive sexuality education, specifically looking at our national SRH policy and increasing access to mental health products. And right now we're really working toward hoping that the government can actually have legislation that increases menstrual equity across Trinidad and Tobago. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for this.
We just see from the organizers, can we go a little bit over another a few more minutes? Okay, great. So do you want to just say a final word or two, and then we will open up for questions?
I was just going to take off and underline what we were discussing around the importance of education. But I think there's a group that we haven't talked about that much, and it's the importance of educating our politicians. Anybody that sat through this summer in the United States and seen the headlines has perhaps been horrified, as I have been, to see the extraordinarily low level of understanding around how contraceptives work. And I think that if we are going to protect women's access to contraceptives, two things have to happen. Women have to raise their voice, and I think in the US they are starting to do that, which is giving some of the politicians pause. But we've also got to lean into advocacy. We really do, and we've got to get down into the nitty-gritty of this is how this works. And we respect different views, but contraception should not be controversial. That should be a basic right. That is a basic right. So to me, that is to take us from the incredible needs of Amina in Africa to women in the US that are struggling right now. We've seen heartbreaking stories in the news. We've got a lot to do.
two quick things. Snap on that. Back to the point about innovation and the private sector, Geralyn was talking about that. I think, by definition, we don't know what innovation hasn't shown us yet. But I suspect there is a lot of innovation that is out there. And the beauty of even technologies that I mentioned, long-acting reversible contraception, doesn't necessarily have to have the man or the husband aware of it, right? The ability to self-manage abortions. These are breakthrough technologies, and I think there's probably more excitement to come in terms of innovation. And then I totally agree with Geralyn's point about, I wish it was simply educating. I think it's actually darker than that, right? We know there are forces in this country and probably all around the world that are just very well educated, but perfectly determined to repress the rights of women. And we have to fight that. And it is a deeper and longer fight than we anticipated, and we have to get ready, we have to gird ourselves. And those of you in this room who are American voters, I encourage you to really lean into this, because there is no more important issue.
So we have time for a few questions from the audience. I believe there will be a microphone that is passed around, or it might even be this very microphone that I am on. So one of the organizers can let me know about that. But in the meantime, I see this hand, and we'll go in that order. So is it this mic? Or is there a second microphone?
I can speak up.
There's a recording, so we do want it mic'd. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Representative of two NGOs. This morning I'm going to do the main representative of Adelman, which is the Association to Lead Women Advancement Nepal. What I have to say is I'm going to concentrate right now on which I represent, the marginalized community, the migrant community, and the displaced people. And actually disabilities too. I don't hear very much about that. It is very difficult, particularly during the pandemic, when my NGO had to, which I helped out, to pay for the PPE to get to the remote villages to save lives, particularly in Nepal, where you have to pay for your hospital bed, and unfortunately, one hospital after another, the people died outside the door. What are you doing for women's rights with these communities? Thank you.
We'll take a couple, and then I'll turn it back over. So I saw this here. Thank you for the support of the microphone. If you remember to state your name.
Yes. Thank you so much. I'm Inês. I'm here representing the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. We represent 1.3 million medical students worldwide across Africa, Eastern Mediterranean region, Europe, Asia Pacific, and the Americas region. And one of our focus areas is actually sexual and reproductive health and rights. We work with UNFPA as well. But my question here is that we've been talking about education and about the role of community, but I also want to bring up the point of medical education and how can actually the private sector help to improve the education conditions within some countries so that our future health workforce can actually play a very active role together with the community. And here, how can we also involve other important organizations such as the World Federation for Medical Education in moving forward with this advocacy part? Because yes, I do believe that if we do not educate our students, how can we expect to bring this to our community? Thank you so much.
Quickly, for those of you who just joined me, my name is Rachel Thomas. I am the Senior Advisor for Women, Peace and Security and DEIA in the Office of the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Sorry, I've said global women's issues, LGBTQI, it gets a little confusing sometimes. But my question actually kind of bounces off of what you asked in the first question. Is a lot of times we talk about women and girls, and then Karl, you talked about people who identify as women, but we are missing a subset of people. For example, trans men can still get pregnant. non-binary persons can get pregnant. They also have uteruses. Intersex people also have uteruses. And so while we in the government are trying to learn how to do data collection without overstepping federal regulations and legal issues, how are private sectors looking at collecting this data, number one, but number two, also being able to talk about this data without sort of receiving that backlash of we are undermining women and girls by talking about people who have uteruses or trans men or things of that nature. Thanks.
Thank you. I saw one more, and then we will go to our panelists. I wish we could do more.
Thank you. I'm also from the Global Fund for Women. I'm Amrita. And I believe we did discuss about comprehensive sexuality education, but I really want to understand that comprehensive sexuality education and the fact that it is a right that is not being, accessible is a power equation issue, right? And how does, while we have the private sector here as well as UNFPA here who's working with the governments, so how do we solve this as a policy issue? Because that it's going to also, now we're saying some 59.9 billion you're saying is the unmet need. I believe it will go up once comprehensive sexuality education becomes a norm. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. Please let us know where you would like to start there, and then we'll hear from other panelists as well.
Thank you so much. So I just want to start at the point for CSE. I think I can speak from the Caribbean region, and something I've recognized from my colleagues is that whilst there are NGOs, young people like myself who are demanding CSE in schools and who are working toward that with communities on the ground, we do have state leaders that are actually, they have like personal biases, and that gets in the way. So most recently, I was employed with our university in Trinidad and Tobago, and we were working toward expanding our health and family life education curriculum so that there's a component for people to actually understand gender-based violence and to include a module on sexuality and consent and stuff like that. But we received a lot of pushback from faith-based organizations. I compiled a 28-page document with feedback from them saying that they don't want CSE in schools. We recently got an office for the International Planned Parenthood Federation in Trinidad and Tobago, and there have been protests outside the office saying we don't want CSE. And there's a very warped idea as to what CSE will do for adolescents. People think that it's gonna make them have sex more. And there was this really weird thing where they said, we don't want our children to be pedophiles. And I'm like, where did you all get this from? Like, that's not what CSE is. But when you have organizations working on the ground to improve access to CSE, but you don't have the support from the state, it's not gonna go anywhere. You can only go so far if you're working on a community level, but there needs to be that state buy-in. You need your prime minister, you need your president to say we need CSE. And we know the pandemic has increased sexual violence, like ridiculously in Trinidad and Tobago, we had a 300% increase for domestic violence. And a lot of children who are displaced because of not being in school. And so it's critical to have CSE. And I think, how do we, and this is a question I think for all of us to consider, is that we are all here, everybody in this room, I think is pro-CSE, but how do we go beyond this room where we are doing this work, but how can we get state leaders to actually move past that, trying to get in line with faith-based organizations, how can we get them on board now to realize that this is very critical?
Thank you. Very good questions. I think Rachel's point about language is an important one, and we probably could spend another 6 or 7 hours wrestling with that. And I don't know the answer to your question, but I'm glad you raised it. I feel the pressure around that. We all, I think, feel some degree of pressure around trying to frame these issues in a way that is honest and responsive to the people who are experiencing them, or whose lived experience we're trying to acknowledge and to respond to. And I am sensitive to the point that I've heard from a number of people that we have to be careful not to give further ammunition to, let's call them our adversaries, by getting caught up in language that allows them to even further retard the progress we're trying to make on the broad, unfinished agenda first and foremost, as we would have called it in the past, for women and girls, which is clearly still unfinished. And so it does, I feel like we haven't yet cracked this code of how to talk about this in a more respectful and diverse and honest way without sacrificing the progress that we know we need to sustain. And I'd love to get your thoughts on it, and I'll ask you after this.
I guess, I think there's some connections actually between what seem to be a very diverse group of questions. But, you know, how do we reach marginalized folks? That's a whopper, right? So we could spend, you know, three days on, and I'm sure learn from each other on ways to do that. But the most important thing, I think, is to keep them in the forefront of our mind. When we see the women and children streaming out of Ukraine, I was thrilled to know that when they crossed the border, not only had people provided diapers and baby supplies, there were boxes of pills, there were condoms, that thoughtful NGOs had given thought to women's sexual needs and their sexual vulnerabilities, frankly, as they are fleeing conflict. So I use that as a good example of thoughtful organizations, and I think obviously we've got to weave this into all of our disaster assistance programs. This is a fundamental need. People need to eat, they need water to drink, they need shelter, and they're gonna have sex. You know, we've got to give them ways to protect them. And I think your point on medical education is really important. Training young doctors and nurses with a modern curriculum on modern methods of contraception with good data on what actually works is critical, and including on the diverse experiences of people that might become pregnant or want to have a child. So I think there's a lot of room for reevaluating our medical curriculum, not just for doctors, but for other healthcare professionals as well. And the last point, I think we've got your example, and maybe because I have a number of friends from Trinidad and Tobago, really resonates with me. And I don't think it's very different in the American South, where you were getting a lot of pushback to pull this kind of education out of schools. And we can't give up, right? We can't give up. We've got to get the government to recognize this, but we've also got to be creative and go around them. Teenagers are really digitally savvy.
Correct.
And if we can be creative, the only way to reach them, we don't give up on reaching them through schools, but it's not the only way. And I know you weren't saying that, but I think even more we've got to stretch ourselves and find younger versions of ourselves that really can be effective in helping us to reach the men, and the girls and boys, wherever they are.
No, I think the questions were excellent, and like you said, Geraldine, they connected. Maybe just to talk about the health system, because I think part of that is the health workforce. And I just came this morning from another session on community health workers and how do we professionalize that so that they don't just remain volunteers in communities as frontline. Many of them, by the way, are women, but that they are actually remunerated, they're regulated, and that they are actually seen as part of that cadre. So right from medical students down to midwives, where we have 900,000 shortfall in midwives at this point in time. Just even the numbers begin to help us if we can address that, if we can ensure that they get into some sort of training, and that we're keeping track of really, the needs are exponential and they will continue to be. And like you said, if we find that there are communities that are being left behind, and data helps us do that, we really need to bring those up front. We need to work and support community groups to be able to really deliver services. And really, again, everybody has a role. I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Really important questions, and I do think that the range of experiences and ideas in this room is something I hope we can tap into. And Ashlee, you said something really powerful, which is how do we get beyond this room? And I think the answer is that we need to get beyond this room together. We need to work together. We need to recognize in each other the allyhood, the solidarity, the support. This week throughout UNGA and then beyond, how can we find ways to find our sameness and build on that outside of this room where it is so desperately needed. You all have laid out the stakes so well. So I do invite folks to connect, beyond this panel. Maybe you were finding someone online as this discussion was going on and you were retweeting each other. Go find that person in person and continue the conversation. I think our panelists will be here for a bit, and so come and talk to them as well. But I do really want to thank again everyone for your engagement here today. Thank you so much for our organizers. Thank you for the brave questions. People shared their, it's not at every UNGA panel that we hear the word sex said many times, even though that is what we are talking about. People shared their personal stories and brought their full selves into the room. And so I just really want to name that and appreciate that. And I hope that sets us all on a good path for the rest of this week and the next week and beyond. So thank you.